Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 17th Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. My name is Maja Czerniewicz. I am Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education at Oxford. These seminars are jointly organized by the Department of Education and St. Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. Before introducing our speaker, let me attend to a few administrative points. This webinar is recorded, as you might have noticed already, and will be posted online in due course on the YouTube channel of the Department of Education. We only record the first half of the webinar, the presentation itself. We won't be recording the Q&A section. Please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar unless you have been asked to speak or invited to ask a question. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function and write out your question that you want to ask or your comment that you want to share with the speaker and with the audience. At the end of the presentation, when your question is selected, you will be invited to ask it yourself directly. When I invite you to ask your question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, state your name and where you are from, and ask your question or share your comment. It's great to start sharing the questions and comments that you might have before the talk ends, okay? Because sometimes we have situations when there are questions and comments remaining, and unfortunately there is no time to ask them any longer since the entire session continues for 1 hour. So I would encourage you to ask your questions, share your comments in the chat function when you have them, okay? Now the best part, let me introduce our speaker, Professor Catherine Montgomery. Catherine Montgomery is Professor of Education at the University of Durham. She also serves as Deputy Executive Dean Global in the Faculty of Social Sciences and Health at Durham University. Catherine leads the International and Comparative Education Research Cluster in the School of Education. Prior to joining Durham University in 2019, Catherine has held professorial posts at the University of Bath and at the University of Hull, both with a focus on international higher education. Catherine is editor for Compare, a journal of international and comparative education, one of the top journals in our field. In fact, Compare published a special issue on the topic of Catherine's talk today, special issue which was titled Rurality and Access to Higher Education. I think it was in 2020. This talk closely links with that issue. In a few moments' time, I will share a link to that issue if you are interested in this topic to read more around it. Catherine's research focuses on internationalization of higher education, as I already mentioned. She has a particular interest in transnational higher education in China and East Asia. Catherine's research work engages with the mobilities and immobilities in higher education and the internationalization of curriculum and knowledge. Catherine has worked closely with Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, researching the role of dialogic STEM education in addressing social and cultural disadvantage in Mexico and in the UK. She has worked with the Creek Institute in London on a research project focusing on their STEM outreach program in schools in London Borough of Camden. She has worked on international and comparative research projects in various other parts of the world, such as Denmark and Vietnam, including a British Council project focusing on internationalization strategy in Vietnam and an ESRC-funded project looking at autonomy and democracy in education. Today's talk is titled Rurality in Globalized Higher Education, Comparative Perspectives from International Doctoral Research Thesis. Without further ado, I will now pass over to our speaker. Thank you so much, Catherine, for joining us. We really look forward to listening to you if you wanted to start sharing your slides.
Thank you very much, Maya. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. Okay, thank you so much for the invitation to talk. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my work with you. I'm going to, if it's okay with everyone, just share my screen so that I can go through the slides. We did have a little bit of difficulty a moment ago, but we have, that's it. Okay, that's great. Can you all see those slides all right? Is that okay, Maya?
Perfect. It's perfect.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk today about rurality in globalized higher education. And I'm going to draw on the work I've been doing with the EThOS collection, which is a large collection of doctoral theses held by the British Library. This is a digital repository, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I'm working with that data. The focus is on this idea of rurality, which is a very interesting topic. It's rurality and marginalisation are linked concepts, and surprisingly, although rurality suggests that it's a geographical idea, in fact, it's an intersectional idea that intersects with class and race and gender, and can be synonymous with ideas around marginalisation. I've looked particularly at rurality in the global south, but the idea of rurality is not just the domain of the global south. This idea of rurality it can be applied in countries such as the USA and the UK. Mexico, Australia, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about knowledge, because the project that I'm working with using the EThOS collection is really about surfacing different forms of knowledge and alternative views and perspectives on knowledge, because actually in universities we work with very narrow knowledge systems, and what counts as valuable or powerful knowledge is quite narrow, and it's also really quite Western focused. So the fact that we receive a lot of international doctoral students, some of you I'm sure are doctoral students here, international doctoral students, but the research carried out by international doctoral students is rarely surfaced as a kind of whole body of knowledge, and the knowledge in that research is also quite often not seen as powerful knowledge. So I started a project in 2018 working with this data, with the EThOS data, and I'm going to say just a little bit about that before we start about rurality. So the EThOS repository held by the British Library contains around about 500,000 doctoral theses, and it's not just social sciences or education. There's work in there from all of the sciences, from all fields of universities in the country. If you think about if a doctoral thesis takes 3 years to write, if we've got 500,000 doctoral theses, that's 1.5 million years of research. What's interesting about that is we don't often try to draw out themes across this research, and we often don't raise it as valuable knowledge. So that's the project that I've been working on, trying to surface some of the research, uncover hidden ideas, uncover less worked with sources of knowledge. So I published one paper. I started off this work in 2018, and I was starting to work what I'm going to call by hand, just by using the EThOS repositories quite broad search tool. So if you put in search terms, 4 or 5 search terms, it'll generate for you a very long list, usually, of doctoral theses. With this project, I looked at internationalization and student engagement with internationalization, and I worked to start with. The search generated about 300 doctoral theses. So if you imagine that a doctoral thesis is 100,000 words long, that is quite a lot of words. So I kind of narrowed by hand, and by reading these things, I narrowed down the group of theses and came up with a group of about 90 theses. And then I did some analysis on those, but this analysis took weeks, a lot of weeks. And what I've been doing more recently is I've been working with the computer science department at Durham to develop an artificial intelligence tool which reads and interrogates the doctoral theses. And I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. But basically, it uses natural language processing and clustering to read all of these theses, and then it generates groups, and it also puts the theses into groups according to your search. Then it generates a title for the groups, and then it generates a written paragraph which summarizes the different the doctorates in that group. I mean, I can answer some questions about that tool, but that's not the main focus of what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about a sort of by hand project that I did, but I'm quite happy to say a bit more about that artificial intelligence tool, which is now just about ready to go live. In the first project that I did, I found some interesting information around how dominant Western theory is in the doctoral theses. As I said, it was kind of much more of a large scale analysis, and I looked at 300 theses. But what I did find, one of the most interesting things that I found, was how dominant Western theory was. So ideas around things like social capital, global citizenship, communities of practice, these kinds of Western developed themes are very, very common in the theses. And also Western theorists like Bourdieu, like Foucault, all of these ideas kept coming back in the thesis. And it seemed to me that there wasn't much space for alternative theories, alternative ways of thinking. And I mean, I talk about this in the first paper, but I won't dwell on this, but I'll come back to it a little bit later. This kind of resonates with the idea of extraversion. You may be familiar with the African philosopher Pauline Hautonji's notion of extraversion, and that outlines the way that researchers in the global south tend to defer to the knowledge systems of the global north, because these are kind of globally seen as having more value or more power. So this is a kind of a theme in Hautonji's work. It's a very interesting area. But again, that is a kind of groundwork for the ideas that I'm working with on the EThOS project. But I'm going to say a little bit, maybe again, I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. So what I did was I wanted to focus on this idea of rurality, because actually I was part of I was a minor part of a big project led by Bristol University on rurality and access in higher education. And that project was led by Sue Timmis and Sheila Treyer and also by Brenda Liebowitz in Johannesburg University, who sadly is no longer with us. But they developed this project, a big ESRC project between the UK and South Africa. And they were looking at rurality in South Africa and access to higher education. That's how I got started and got interested on this project, because I was the UK advisor on that project. So I wanted to explore this idea of rurality, and I wanted to find a different way of looking at it. So I came to the work I had been doing with the EThOS project, and I decided to do a search of the doctoral theses to find out what those theses were telling us about rurality, about the rurality and access to higher education. So I used these three terms: ethnicity, rurality, and access to higher education, because as well as ethnicity, as well as rurality being intersectional with class and race and gender, there's also a very close intersection with ethnicity. So I used this as a term in the search. And what I did on this one was I was taking a deeper dive into the theses, and I was looking at a smaller number of theses. I searched, I'll say a little bit more about the search in a minute. I did get a lot of theses to start with, but then I narrowed it down and explored those theses in a bit more detail. I want to just say something about rurality before we start, because as I said at the beginning, you know, you would expect a term like rurality is kind of set against urban, so urban versus rural. is what you often hear. And so you would expect that rurality is a place, or that rurality is an area. But in fact, rurality is not just a kind of physical or geographic description, but it's also a kind of parallel concept with marginalisation. You could think about it as being a kind of, if you think about the phenomenon of globalisation and this idea between local and global, again, those are not necessarily geographical terms. Rurality is quite similar to that, but it intersects with other key things, you know, with those areas that I was talking about. Form of marginalisation alongside those other labels. And it's a very, very highly politicized concept. You know, if you think about it in the context of South Africa, it's particularly acute there, because obviously when apartheid was at its height, the apartheid policy sent Black communities out of the cities into the rural areas, and the cities and the better resourced areas were occupied by the white community. So this concept's very highly politicized. And as I said before, it's not the domain only of countries like South Africa or countries in the global South. If you think about the USA, there's some, you know, highly, some rural areas of the USA that are very deprived areas and have these socio-economic marginalisation, as well as, you know, what we associate with the global South. And if you think about the UK, there's a difference between access to higher education in different parts of the country. I won't go into that, but most important to think, actually, rurality is not necessarily a geographical term. So when we start to look comparatively at different countries, it's interesting that some countries, and I pick out here China and Mexico, have separate or parallel systems of universities specifically designed to cater for ethnic minorities. And as I said before, this idea of ethnicity and rurality are complexly interwoven. The system in China is called the Minzu universities of China's 15 different Minzu universities. Examples are, well, there's one in Beijing, but there's also one in Mongolia. And some of those universities in China are located in the areas that they're aiming to serve, such as the Mongolian University. They aim to develop, you know, specific linguistic and cultural diversity, linguistic needs. And Mexico also has this system. Mexico has 8 interculturales, las Universidades Interculturales, and these were established in this time period between 2003 and 2007, and exactly the same. It was aiming to address marginalisation of rural populations and improve access of those populations to university. However, there is a tension in these universities, in these separate systems, between supporting the needs of these specific groups, maintaining their languages, and raising their cultural diversity, but also, unfortunately, that is also in parallel with a kind of isolation or exoticization of their communities. And this, Wang 2017 is one of the doctoral theses that I was looking at. And this is borne out in research, but also by Schmelkes in 2009, this kind of complex tension between addressing linguistic and cultural needs, but also this issue of isolation. So I think there's a very, that tension that I was talking about just a moment ago is really, you know, very, very much part of this idea of rurality. And, you know, again, the idea of rurality is very, very linked with colonialism. It has a colonial past. It's associated with racial and social injustices. So because of that, for someone like me, a white middle-class Western woman, coming at trying to get at this idea of rurality is sometimes not a comfortable place, because, you know, it's difficult. It's not appropriate for me to speak on behalf of these communities, especially communities who lack the opportunity to have their own voice. So what I wanted to do with the doctoral thesis was try to locate an alternative line of thinking around rurality and ethnicity and access to higher education. And I cast the voices of international PhD students as marginalised, partly because their knowledge is marginalised, because it's not surfaced in that forum, in the EThOS forum, and quite often they've researched rurality and ethnicity in their own country context, so they're bringing that insider point of view, and bringing that the voice that we need to hear around those communities. So that's what I'm hoping that the EThOS collection offers. So just to get back to what I did, I hope I'm not going too far over time. I did a search using some strings. Rurality, you can see the strings there on the slide. The first search generated 36 theses, the next one 114 theses, and then the next one 25 theses. Obviously, each of these theses is very long, and as I said before, it took me around about 3 weeks to read all these theses and to kind of narrow them down, to narrow down the data set, trying to identify the most relevant to this area. So what I did, I actually identified a set of 12, only 12 theses that I focused on for this research, and they generated what I considered to be 4 themes. One of the themes was ideologies and political influences. There were 3 doctoral theses around this. Deficit and minoritisation, 3 theses. Intersectionality, and finally rethinking systems and solutions. So this is what the doctorates was telling us about rurality in higher education, rurality in global higher education. And as you can see from the surnames, pretty much all of these, apart from one, Morgan, 1981, an early thesis, pretty much all of these were international students writing about their own country contexts. Very wide range of countries involved there, you know, China, Mongolia, all sorts of, you know, pretty much, I think there was four different continents represented in those theses. So these were the 4 areas. I'm going to say a little bit perhaps about a couple of them, because I don't want to go on too long. It's 20, I think, Maya, if I talk maybe until 22, will that be too far, or 25?
That will be great, thank you.
Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about 1 or 2 of these ideas. So really interestingly, again, going back to this idea of rurality not really being a geographical issue, what I found from these theses, which was one Young, Morgan, and I think there was Zhang in there as well, was that actually ideology and politics has a huge influence on the education of rural populations. So in these theses, some of the ideas were around the role of the state in influencing rural and ethnic populations' access So where political change happens, that can exert a really strong influence on rural populations' access to higher education. There was an example, for example, the third one down there, Morgan was talking about how an initial investment in Mexico into equal access for rural populations during the 1920s was interrupted actually by the development of the country's capitalist economy. So as investment happened in Mexico, and Mexico became a richer nation, a more wealthy nation, ironically, that was when actually that initiative that had started in the 20s was interrupted whilst the country developed. Which, I mean, you would expect, wouldn't you, that as development and wealth increases in a country, it improves those kinds of marginalisation. But actually, according to this one thesis, that was not the case. So it was really interesting. Several of the theses were dealing with this idea of ideological and political tensions, which as a barrier to improvement of rural populations' higher education. Particularly, I was focusing on higher education. Another theme that came out was around this idea of deficit and minoritisation. So again, this is really interesting, I think, because it applies not just to rurality, but it also applies to other forms of marginalisation, where groups or identified groups of students can, like a process of categorisation or a student grouping, can result in, deficit models being applied in education. At least two of the theses were really focusing on that, this idea of minoritisation. And actually, Maarseveen, 2015, her thesis actually was made into a book. It's a very interesting book called Minoritisation, and she actually coined this term, minoritisation, which I think is a really interesting concept. And Chan, 2005, this is another one of the theses, talks about kind of systemic racism and talks about this idea of snow capping, where top positions in higher education are still occupied by white, male, middle class senior academics. So, that was all about how, rural populations do not have, especially rural and ethnic populations, do not have those role models in senior roles in education. And, Black and minority ethnic staff are kind of overrepresented in lower academic positions or in clerical or manual roles. So that's, another, and that was really talking about how, how that has an impact on rural and ethnic students in higher education. A lot of stuff on intersectionality. I won't over talk about this too much, but really interesting analogies around intersectionality. Very interesting theses in this area. And Cruz Arquila talking about recognizing invisibility. There's just some absolute gems of terms and ideas in these theses. Some of which are obviously taken on and published by the students, but others which are kind of hidden gems, I think, of ideas. And yeah, very interesting. An earlier thesis from 1991, talking about equality of access for rural and ethnic groups for Uyghurs in Xinjiang province in China, and how the implementations of those policies were working at the time. So I mean, there's interesting historical ideas to be found in the thesis as well, because many of them are themes that have been going on for a long time and are still current in contemporary education. And finally, again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but a lot of the theses talked about rethinking systems and solutions and how systems of universities, how the university can act as an agent of change. That was Othello, and how the university system needs to change to accommodate rural populations, rural communities, rather than expecting those rural communities to come into the university and adapt or like learn about the system. The university has to be ready for them. Again, another example, Mabar from the Cameroon, really interesting example from the Cameroon, talking about how the university needs to recast itself as a force for community transformation, and needs to more actively engage with rural communities. So those are the 4 themes. I mean, I could talk more, but I'm going to just come to a conclusion now. So what was really interesting, as well as
finding out amazing, really incredible bits of research from those theses. You can draw out these themes, and what those theses were telling me was that equality and access for rural populations doesn't seem to be improving very quickly, and the influence of intersectionality kind of has this kind of maelstrom of characteristics and factors that are all intersecting in a kind of damaging way, really. This echoes D'Souza Santos's talks about, current turbulence of scales between large scale, between roots and branches, and large scale and small scale challenges, and this chaotic confusion of scale among phenomena, which kind of, I think, is really interesting. I think it's one of the major influences on how easily we can move forward in improving education. So just before I finish, just a few words about the tool. So all of the stuff that I've been talking about today, pretty much I did by hand, but I've been working on a funded project, ESRC funded project, ERC IIA, which is Impact Acceleration Account. And I've been working with the computer science department at Durham. We've developed an artificial intelligence tool that reads the theses. So it reads the PDFs, and then it generates them into groups, generates titles for the groups, and then it generates a paragraph which describes the research, not of individual theses, but across a number of theses, which is the big difference. So it basically does what I've described in the Rurality project. Instead of it taking 3 weeks, it takes 10 seconds. And we had a research assistant working with us from computer science, and he did say to me, I'm really worried about the tool because it's taking such a long time to generate the searches. He says it's taking 10 seconds. That's, he wasn't very happy about that. But, obviously these things by hand, take a lot longer. So yeah, I'm still continuing to work on that and work with the British Library and the EThOS team to try to kind of develop this tool. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see people a bit better. Okay.